When African leader Ibrahim Traoré is called to an American courtroom to answer for his bold policies, what starts as an effort to put him in his place quickly shifts into a striking confrontation. Through steady resolve and unwavering honesty, Traoré flips the narrative, turning what should have been a trial into a powerful moment that challenges global power dynamics. His stance exposes Western double standards and sparks inspiration across nations. This is the little-known account of how one man's refusal to yield changed everything. The prosecutor's grin was the kind you see when someone thinks they've already won, a flash of teeth that said, "This will be fun." Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Weston straightened his deep red tie and organized his notes, occasionally glancing at the empty defendant's seat. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. buzzed with tension. Reporters whispered, pens clicked, cameras stood ready. "I heard he's not even bringing a lawyer," Weston murmured to his junior associate. She nodded. "He rejected our appointed counsel, too." Weston's grin widened. Perfect. But by day's end, that confident smile would be gone. Rain pounded against the courthouse windows. The sky looked like dusk, though it was only 10 a.m. Lightning flashed now and then, lighting up the soaked faces of protesters outside, some backing Traoré, others shouting against him. Yet none of them left. Inside, the gallery was packed, with diplomats, plainclothes intelligence agents, and media from every continent. It was rare for the U.S. to summon a foreign leader to stand before its courts. When it happened, it was as much a show as it was a legal process. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked in alone. He wore a plain olive military uniform. No medals, no tie, no entourage. He carried a briefcase and spoke to no one. No translator followed him. Just a 36-year-old revolutionary who had taken control of Burkina Faso 2 years earlier. He stood tall, eyes forward. Some people didn't rise as court protocol requires. Others whispered, sarcastically, "Is this it?" One European diplomat sneered. "This is the man causing all the chaos?" "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Richards," the court officer announced. Judge Richards, with silver-streaked hair and 3 decades on the bench, took her seat and scanned the room. Her eyes paused on Traoré, who held her gaze steadily. What was she thinking? Curiosity, confusion, or perhaps a sense that this would be no ordinary hearing? If you've ever seen someone get completely underestimated, hit that like button, and let us know in the comments what happened next. The court will now hear the case of the United States government versus Ibrahim Traoré, acting head of State of Burkina Faso, Judge Richards said, adjusting her glasses. "Prosecution, please present the charges." Weston stood confidently, voice strong. "Your Honor, under the Global Accountability Act of 2023, the United States brings forward the following charges: violation of international security protocols, disruption of regional alliances, unauthorized, military restructuring, endangerment of NATO operations, and intentional interference with humanitarian aid delivery. The room stirred. These weren't standard criminal charges. They were political statements wrapped in legal terms. From the beginning, the Global Accountability Act was controversial. Critics claimed it was modern colonialism in legal form, a method for Western powers to legally go after leaders who resisted their control. This was its first major test case. "Mr. Traoré," the judge asked, "do you understand the charges against you?" Traoré stood. "I understand what has been stated, Your Honor." His English was clear and fluent, with only a light accent. Those expecting a translator quickly revised their assumptions. "Do you have legal representation?" "I will represent myself," he said. "The court strongly recommends." "With respect, Your Honor," Traoré said, calmly interrupting, "if I cannot speak for myself, then I have no reason to be here." A wave of murmurs passed through the room. Judge Richards looked displeased but nodded. "Very well. How do you plead?" Traoré's face remained calm. "I do not plead anything. I am here to speak the truth. The rest is just procedure." Weston smirked. This was going to be easier than he imagined, but that sense of control was about to disappear. "The prosecution may begin." Judge Richards, voice firm, announced that Weston had approached the witness stand, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Traoré, do you acknowledge this court's authority to examine your actions as a head of state?" It was a question dressed as protocol, but it was a trap. If Traoré said yes, he surrendered sovereignty. If he said no, he risked appearing defiant and uncooperative. The courtroom held its breath. Traoré lifted his head slowly, his eyes steady. There was no anger, no fear, just a quiet certainty. "No," he said calmly, "but I do understand the world is watching, so I will speak." Weston blinked, caught off guard. That wasn't the response he had anticipated. He'd expected outrage or hesitant submission, not this composed redirection. Quickly regaining his footing, the prosecutor pressed on. "So you're saying you don't respect international law?" "I respect laws that are truly international," Traoré replied evenly, "not those created by a few to govern the many." Judge Richards leaned forward. "Mr. Traoré, I recognize your concerns, but I must remind you this court operates under established legal frameworks. I understand, Your Honor. I've come here willingly, out of respect for open dialogue, but I cannot pretend that my presence confirms the legitimacy of these proceedings." There was a noticeable shift in the room. Reporters paused mid-sentence. Diplomats exchanged wary glances. This was not a defendant searching for legal loopholes. It was something else, something deeper, and it was just beginning. Weston cleared his throat. "Let's turn to specifics. In March of last year, you expelled French military forces that had been deployed in Burkina Faso for counter-terrorism efforts. Following that, there was a noticeable spike in extremist violence. How do you defend what many see as risking your nation's security?" It was the prosecution's strongest argument, portraying Traoré as someone who put ideology ahead of public safety. Traoré didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed an object on the witness stand's rail, a small, faded photograph. "May I approach the bench, Your Honor?" He asked. Judge Richards nodded, curiosity edging out formality. Traoré handed her the photo. "This was taken 3 days before I made that decision." The judge studied it, her expression shifting subtly. "For the record," she said, "this appears to be a village. There are bodies on the ground." "Tinikov village," Traoré confirmed. 46 civilians killed, while French forces were stationed less than 20 kilometers away. It was the 8th such massacre that month. He turned toward Weston. "When I came to power, my people were dying, not metaphorically, but literally. Foreign troops patrolled our towns, yet terrorists roamed freely. Corporations extracted our resources while our children learned in the open air." His voice remained steady, but a firm energy now drove his words. "For 10 years, we were told to be patient, that safety would come if we followed instructions, that wealth would follow if we signed the right agreements." He gestured toward the photograph. This is what that patience led to. Weston's expression tightened. Tragic events don't justify dismantling an entire security structure. The French presence was part of a larger multilateral effort. There were 2,400 terrorist attacks in my country during those 5 years. Traoré cut in. After we replaced foreign troops with our own volunteers and military forces, attacks had dropped by 60% in just 6 months. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. This detail wasn't in the briefing notes. "Still, I made a decision," Traoré continued, "not for praise or reassurance. I chose sovereignty, and yes, I turned down assistance that came with strings attached." He met the prosecutor's gaze directly. If that unsettles this courtroom, maybe the issue isn't me. It's the reflection I'm holding up. Hit that subscribe button if you're interested in more stories about standing up to authority, and don't forget to tap the bell icon. Weston's jaw tightened. His casual self-assurance vanished. Are you accusing this court, this country, of hypocrisy? He asked. I'm not accusing, Traoré answered. I'm just not pretending it isn't true. There it was again, his quiet defiance. Not anger, not distraction, just truth, stated so plainly that it was hard to dismiss. Judge Richard's pen hovered above her notepad. We ask the defendant to stay within the scope of questioning, she said. Traoré didn't flinch. I am, he replied. You asked about my decisions. I'm explaining them. Weston paced in front of the witness stand, recalibrating. His prepared lines no longer seemed enough. Let's discuss the Wagner Group, he said at last, referring to the Russian private military company. Reports suggest you allowed their personnel into your country after removing Western troops. How does swapping one foreign force for another represent sovereignty? A calculated question. But Traoré held steady. We have training agreements with several countries, including Russia, Turkey, and Iran, he responded. Unlike past deals, these partners don't demand control of our resources or try to steer our policies. They don't build permanent bases or take authority over our people. He leaned in just slightly. It's not about which outsiders are here. It's about who sets the conditions for their presence. Despite the heavy air conditioning, sweat gathered on Weston's brow. So, you admit to aligning with governments sanctioned by the international community? The international community you refer to represents less than 20% of the world's population, Traoré noted. Outside your media echo chamber, there are very different views on which governments deserve sanctions. A journalist in the third row let out an audible breath. No one talks like this in a U.S. courtroom. No one questions the assumptions behind the questions themselves. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't here to follow the script. Weston returned to his table, flipping through his papers with visible frustration. His junior colleague passed him a note. He read it, nodded slightly, and turned back to the stand. Let's shift to democracy, he said, his confidence returning. Your rise to power wasn't exactly through the ballot box, was it? It was a predictable tactic. When policy gets uncomfortable, question the leader's legitimacy. No, Traoré said calmly. It was necessary. He reached into his jacket and unfolded another photo, this one in color, clearer. 3 boys stood on dirt paths. Burned-out houses loomed behind them. May I? He asked the judge, who gave a nod. He handed her the photo. That, he said, is what democracy looked like under the leaders you supported. Empty promises and mass graves. I examined the image carefully before handing it to the court clerk. My people didn't vote with ballots, Traoré continued. They voted with trust, and they're watching this trial. He gestured toward the courtroom, the cameras, and beyond. When elections become mere performances and leaders turn into figureheads, democracy ceases to exist. I didn't seize power from the people. I reclaimed it from those who had already taken it from them. The room fell silent. Even the reporters paused their typing. Weston loosened his red tie. That's a convenient argument for any military coup leader, isn't it? He asked. The people wanted it. And how exactly do you measure this supposed mandate? A faint smile touched Traoré's lips. When I walk through the streets of Ouagadougou without bodyguards, when mothers name their children after me, when thousands join the defense forces voluntarily, those aren't statistics you'll find in your spreadsheets, Mr. Weston. But they are real. Judge Richards arched an eyebrow. Mr. Traoré, while personal popularity may be rewarding, it doesn't address the foundations of lawful governance. With respect, Your Honor, Traoré replied, when your own country faced grave threats in its early years, It too prioritized survival over strict procedures. History didn't condemn those choices. It understood them. I ask only for the same consideration. Judge us not on whether we follow every line in your rule book, but on whether we're building a future where rules actually matter. Something was shifting in that courtroom, something the organizers hadn't foreseen. The judge's tone was softening, her questions growing less combative. The spectators weren't leaning in with skepticism, but with intrigue. Weston was slowly losing control of the narrative. After a brief recess, he returned with renewed determination. If he couldn't win the argument on security or democracy, perhaps economics would provide firmer footing. "Mr. Traoré," he began, "since assuming power, you've canceled contracts with several Western mining companies, taken control of gold mines, and redirected profits to your administration. These actions have cost investors billions and violated international agreements." He laid a document on the evidence table. "This report outlines the economic damage your policies have caused to reputable businesses operating in good faith." Traoré glanced at the report but didn't touch it. "Reputable," he repeated. "That's an interesting word choice." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, the mining contract in this report gave 92% of profits to a foreign company. It was signed by an official who, a month later, acquired a villa in Monaco. Is that what Mr. Weston calls reputable?" Before the judge could respond, he pressed on. "And as for good faith, the contract allowed cyanide leaching, a method banned in Europe and the US. It granted unlimited groundwater use in regions prone to drought. It demanded state protection for company assets but banned inspections of mining conditions." His voice remained steady, but his words carried weight. "We didn't cancel these contracts, we corrected them. The mines are still operational. The companies still earn revenue, just not obscenely. And now, our children go to schools built with our own resources." Weston slammed his hand on the table. "That's not how global trade works. You can't just rewrite deals because you don't like the terms." Judge Richards raised her hand. "Mr. Weston, please." But Traoré was already replying. "When those terms were imposed through bribery and intimidation, correcting them isn't just a right, it's an obligation." He looked around the courtroom. Many here represent countries that have rewritten financial laws when convenient, bailed out banks, forgiven debts, altered terms. But when African nations seek the same flexibility, suddenly contracts become untouchable. He leaned forward. "If defending our economic independence is a crime, then yes, I'm guilty. But so is every country that's ever put its people's needs above foreign profits." A Ukrainian diplomat seated near the front began to clap quietly. A court officer gave him a sharp look, and he stopped, but not before others had joined in, however briefly. Weston turned to the judge, hoping for support, but her expression gave nothing away. The foundation of his case was crumbling. If you're learning something new about global politics from this video, hit that like button and share your views in the comments. Should economic independence take precedence over international agreements? With his arguments on security and economics weakening, Weston played his final hand: humanitarian concerns. "Your policies," he began, "have led several major aid organizations to suspend operations in Burkina Faso. Doctors Without Borders, the World Food Program, UNICEF, all have reported government interference. How do you justify that? Obstructing humanitarian aid to your own vulnerable citizens. It sounded indefensible. Who could possibly justify denying food and medicine to those in need?" Traoré nodded, slowly, acknowledging the weight of the accusation. "Mr. Weston," he began, "have you ever been to one of these aid distribution centers in my country?" The prosecutor hesitated. "I haven't, personally, but the reports I've seen..." Traoré cut in. "I've visited them many times, before and after taking office. He turned more fully toward the gallery, now speaking not just to the court, but to the cameras, to the world. Let me tell you what I've seen. Foreign workers living in compounds with swimming pools and air conditioning, driving cars that cost more than what an entire village earns in a year, offices that use up 60% of the aid budget, aid systems that build dependency instead of resilience. He paused, allowing the words to settle. We didn't expel these groups, Mr. Weston. We asked them to adapt, to buy food locally instead of shipping it in, to train Burkina Faso doctors instead of cycling in foreign staff every few months, to coordinate with our government, not work as if they were a separate authority. He raised his hands slightly. Some agreed. They're still operating, more effectively than before. Others refused. They chose to leave rather than change. Weston scrambled to respond. These organizations follow protocols built on decades of global experience. Your inexperienced government can't just rewrite established humanitarian standards. Best practices, Traoré repeated, his voice rising slightly for the first time. After 50 years of these best practices, my country is still poor. Our problems still exist. He looked directly at Weston. At what point do we admit that maybe these practices aren't as effective as claimed? A heavy silence filled the room. Foreign aid, as it's structured today, Traoré went on, his voice steady but passionate, preserves the very problems it claims to solve. It treats symptoms while keeping in place the systems that cause the illness. We want to heal, not manage, our nation's wounds. Even Weston seemed unsure how to respond. Judge Richards took off her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. I believe we could all use a brief recess. Court will resume in 15 minutes. As the gallery buzzed with conversation, Traoré remained seated at the witness stand, motionless. No one approached him. No one dared. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. Weston's aggressive confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve to finish his questioning without causing further harm. Mr. Traoré, he began, do you regret anything from your time in office? It was meant to trap him, admit fault, and weaken his argument or appear arrogant by refusing. There was a long pause. Yes, Traoré said at last. Tension gripped the room. Weston straightened, sensing a rare opening after hours of frustration. But Traoré wasn't finished. I regret not acting sooner. I regret believing the world would come when we cried out. I regret thinking that respect could be requested. His voice grew stronger, though he never raised it. Respect must be earned, or taken. The atmosphere shifted again. The courtroom no longer belonged to the judge or the lawyers. It belonged to the man speaking truth. Few dared to say, I regret that children died while we waited for permission to save them. I regret how cheaply we sold our dignity for so long. He looked straight at Judge Richards, not as a defendant, but as a leader speaking to an equal. But most of all, I regret that this conversation is even necessary. That a nation has to explain its right to choose its own future. That sovereignty is now treated as a privilege, not a right. His words lingered, difficult to ignore, harder to challenge. Weston looked down at his notes. Then, quietly, he closed the folder. Your Honor, he said, the prosecution has no further questions at this time. But Traoré wasn't finished. This trial isn't about legalities, he said, rising to his feet. It's about discomfort. Discomfort that an African nation dared to stand on its own, that we chose pride over dependence. He looked around. The courtroom, meeting the eyes of reporters, diplomats, and onlookers. So if I must be judged for restoring dignity to my people, then let history make that judgment clear. Judge Richards opened her mouth, but Weston quickly interrupted. Your Honor, I request a recess. All eyes turned to him. The prosecutor who began with such confidence was now pale and silent. "A recess?" Judge Richards repeated. "We just returned from one." "The government wishes to reconsider its stance on certain aspects of the case," Weston said, struggling to compose himself. The judge studied him carefully, then nodded. "Very well. Court is adjourned. Adjourned until tomorrow morning." As the courtroom murmured in hushed tones, Traoré calmly gathered his few documents. He had delivered his message. If this story speaks to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more insights you won't find in mainstream coverage. The hearing was never resumed, not the following day, nor ever again. The official statement pointed to complex jurisdictional issues that required additional examination. The case was postponed indefinitely, but by then, the point was moot. Within hours, clips of Traoré's testimony swept across social media, translated into dozens of languages. The footage traveled swiftly, platform to platform, country to country. "We chose dignity over dependency," quickly became a slogan, echoed in university lectures from Cairo to Caracas. Scholars dissected his words. In diplomatic spaces, his name began to stir caution rather than indifference. 3 days after the hearing, crowds amassed outside the courthouse, not in the dozens, but in the thousands. Some held posters bearing Traoré's face, others raised mirrors, a silent but powerful gesture. CNN aired a special segment titled "The Trial That Backfired." The Guardian published an op-ed questioning the credibility of the Global Accountability Act. Even Fox News aired a piece pondering whether U.S. foreign policy had grown detached from the global reality. Inside government institutions, perspectives shifted rapidly. Intelligence reports that had once dismissed Traoré as just another short-lived military figure were discarded. New briefings now described a sharp intellect with persuasive influence. "He struck a nerve," a State Department official was overheard saying. "We need to figure out what it is." 1 week later, Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso. Unlike his discreet arrival in Washington, his return home was impossible to ignore. The road from the airport in Ouagadougou teemed with people for, 17 kilometers. Women let out celebratory ululations, men played drums, and children waved handmade flags from their parents' shoulders. They weren't ordered to show up. They came because something had shifted. Their leader had entered the heart of global authority, spoken boldly, and returned unshamed, even victorious. For a nation long burdened with international embarrassment, this was a defining moment. As Traoré's car moved slowly through the masses, he stood through the sunroof, not in boastful victory, but with his fist raised in quiet solidarity. At the presidential palace, he addressed the nation directly. "They summoned me to their court expecting me to be judged," he said, "but it was not I who stood exposed." The crowd erupted in applause. They believed our sovereignty was up for negotiation, that our dignity could be bought. He paused, scanning the crowd. They were wrong. That evening, as celebrations continued throughout the capital, Traoré convened with his cabinet. There was no celebration in that meeting, only clear intent. "We have their attention," he said. "Now we must turn it into impact. The world is watching. Let them witness not just our words, but our actions." New directives were issued immediately. Speed up the rural electrification initiative, double output at the new pharmaceutical facility, fast-track the agricultural irrigation projects. Traoré understood that powerful words weren't enough. His speech in Washington had earned him a spotlight, but that spotlight was only a means, not an end. These developments weren't just symbolic wins. Their impact quickly spilled beyond Burkina Faso. Within weeks, Mali and Niger declared a tighter alliance with Burkina Faso, combining military efforts and launching a shared investment plan that favored local businesses. In Chad, The government began revisiting its oil agreements with Western corporations, citing new regional standards focused on resource control. Even Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, long seen as loyal to Western interests, started making quiet shifts. They pushed for more domestic cocoa processing before export and began re-examining military agreements with Western nations. In foreign capitals, urgency set in. A new strategy was being put together. Direct pressure had failed, and failed publicly. It was time to pivot. "We can't turn him into a martyr," an EU diplomat told her US counterpart over a secure call, "but we can't let this movement spread either." The pushback came swiftly. Media outlets began highlighting concerns about Burkina Faso's human rights situation. Economic experts predicted a bleak financial outlook. Social media posts emphasized ongoing security issues. But something deeper had shifted. The narrative could no longer be dictated from abroad. For every negative headline, dozens of independent creators shared content praising Burkina Faso's new course. African thinkers, once hesitant to speak up, began openly discussing Western influence. Publishers funded new books. Universities updated course material. What was once a fringe discussion had become a central, widely shared debate. 6 months. After the failed trial, a private jet touched down on a remote airstrip outside Ouagadougou. There were no cameras waiting and no press coverage. On board was Marcus Weston, the once confident prosecutor, now without a smile. His arrival wasn't noted on any public schedule. No reporters followed his route to the presidential office. 4 hours, Weston and Ibrahim Traoré met in a modest room. No staff, no note-takers, no records. What was discussed remains a mystery. When Weston finally left, his expression was serious, contemplative. He turned down a military escort, choosing instead to walk the streets of the capital on his own, quietly observing. 2 weeks later, he stepped down from the Justice Department. His public statement was short. "There are moments that fundamentally change how you see the world. I've had one of those." He refused all interviews. In time, he accepted a teaching role at a small college in Vermont, where his courses on international law unexpectedly gained a large following. Would you have wanted to overhear that secret meeting? Share your guesses in the comments. What do you think was said? A year after the Washington hearing, Ibrahim Traoré faced his toughest challenge yet. The gains had been meaningful, but incomplete. Terrorist incidents had fallen but hadn't vanished. Economic changes brought both opportunities and disruption. The road to sovereignty was proving to be both essential and demanding. On the anniversary of his return, just as he prepared to speak to the nation, news broke. A major attack near the northern border. 30 civilians dead, a school destroyed, children abducted. His advisors urged a delay. "The timing is awful," they told him. "Let's handle the crisis, then address the nation with solutions in hand." Traoré disagreed. That night he appeared on camera. No teleprompter, no written speech. "Today, enemies of our nation took innocent lives," he began. "They believe fear will break our will, that we'll plead for foreign rescue and fall back into dependence." The country listened silently. "They are wrong," he declared. He offered no excuses, only a concrete plan. Expanded civilian defense training, faster drone production, and stronger intelligence cooperation with nearby states. "This path is hard," he admitted, "but it is ours to walk." If it were easy, someone would have done it long ago. There will be setbacks, there will be pain, there will be moments when the old ways feel safer. His voice grew steadier. "But we will not go back. Not because I order it, but because you, the people of Burkina Faso, have experienced dignity. And once you've tasted it, you won't settle for anything less." The speech was not a celebration, nor did it offer quick fixes or false hopes, but its honesty echoed far beyond the country's borders. Leaders across Africa referred to it as a standard for transparent leadership. Universities added it to political science curricula. Even critics acknowledged its moral force. In Washington, prosecutors tried to portray Traoré as a reckless radical. Instead, what emerged was something more profound: a leader unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths, to question dominant narratives, and to face the outcomes of hard decisions. 3 years after the trial that was meant to discredit him, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly, not as a defendant, not as a rebel, but as an elected head of state. The election didn't mirror Western models. It blended traditional village dialogue with formal voting methods. It emphasized consensus over confrontation. Critics labeled it flawed. Supporters called it genuine. But no one could deny the legitimacy it had earned. As Traoré stepped up to the podium, the hall fell into silence. This was no longer the soldier who had taken power out of necessity. This was a leader who had proven himself through resolve and principle. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, "I come before you not to celebrate victories, but to invite collaboration, not as a perfect nation, but as one committed to shaping its own path." He spoke of new opportunities, South-South partnerships that bypass old centers of influence, technology sharing that built self-reliance instead of dependence, and security strategies that respected cultural realities. "The world is evolving," he said. "The question is whether our institutions will evolve with it, or be replaced by ones that reflect today's truths." This wasn't a warning. It was a clear-eyed observation from someone who had lived his beliefs. When he concluded, something remarkable happened. Delegates from nations representing more than half the global population stood in applause, not just African countries, but also nations from Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. At the back of the room, a silver-haired woman watched silently. Judge Eleanor Richards, now retired, had come as an observer. As applause continued, a journalist beside her asked for her thoughts. "History doesn't always move in straight lines," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes disruption is what helps it find direction." She observed as Traoré received recognition from leaders who once dismissed him. "We thought we were judging him," she added. "Maybe he was judging us." The journalist asked if she thought the trial had been a mistake. Judge Richards gave a measured smile. "I think it brought truths to light, just not the ones we expected." As she turned to go, she offered one last reflection. "The court of world opinion delivers its own verdicts, and those tend to last." Outside the UN, light rain misted the streets of New York City. Times Square billboards flashed updates on the markets and celebrity news. Life moved on. But inside government halls, universities, community spaces, and online forums, a conversation lived on. One that had started in a Washington courtroom when a young leader refused to play the role assigned to him. Ibrahim Traoré made history not because he took power, but because he dared to speak truth to it, not just for his people but for anyone determined to write their own story. What was meant to diminish him, in the end, elevated him, not just with political legitimacy, but with something even more lasting: moral clarity. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more content that questions the stories we're often told to accept. The end.